Welcome to Yahoo Finance. I'm Kristen Myers, and this is 2020, A Time for Change. Positive coronavirus cases have now soared above 3 million as the country has seen daily case counts start to spike. And while the virus does not care about your race or ethnicity, Black communities have been disproportionately impacted. That's where we're going to be starting the conversation today. And as always, Sabeel Marcellus and Jen Rogers are also here with me. Now, minority businesses were already facing challenges even before COVID-19, and they are now some of the hardest hit. The PPP program has largely failed to help micro businesses, and without further stimulus targeted at these companies, our first guest, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley from Massachusetts, says it could only widen the racial wealth gap even further. Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to start on that point of micro businesses. Many Black businesses fall into that category. I want to ask you about your new act, the SOS Act, Saving Our Street Act, and how that is going to specifically help those micro businesses that are Black owned and Black led.
First, I just want to say that representing the Massachusetts 7th, this is one of the most diverse, vibrant, dynamic districts in the country, and one of the most unequal, where the median wealth for a Black family is $8 and for a white family is $247,000. In a 3-mile radius from Cambridge, home to MIT and Harvard, to Roxbury, the Blackest part of my district, median household income drops by $50,000. So the inequities and disparities that persist in the 7th, my district is no anomaly, they persist throughout the country. And the Saving Our Street Act that I introduced in partnership with Senator Kamala Harris is responsive legislation. We saw in the first round of PPP, our businesses did not benefit. In the second round, we saw some progress because we fought, members of the Financial Services Committee under the leadership of Chairwoman Waters, for CDFIs and MDIs to be included as lenders. So we saw some progress, but not nearly enough. So we've introduced the Saving Our Street Act. It's responsive legislation. We heard from business owners in community that they didn't want loans, they needed grants. So this is a $124.5 billion micro business grant fund, with 75% of the grants being targeted to businesses historically underrepresented. So those are women, immigrant, and minority owned. And then also, I do believe that that which gets measured gets done, and it requires a reporting of data on who receives those grants. Race, what's the race makeup, the gender makeup, industry.
So I should also point out for everyone at home that you are integral to the actual demographic reporting data that the CDC now has to gather in terms of who is dying and who is contracting this virus. And there was a great and fantastic New York Times article that was actually based on some of that data that you pushed to make sure that the government started to report. On that point of the SOS Act, if it doesn't get passed, what do you fear happens to those Black and brown communities and those business owners in specific that continue to be left behind when it comes to economic stimulus?
Sure. I mean, look, the Black community has been disproportionately impacted by the confluence of 3 crises: the coronavirus, and then the only thing the coronavirus cannot kill, racism, the pandemic, and the scourge that is police brutality, and then an economic crisis and hardship born out of the crisis of the pandemic. And so we are navigating all 3 of these and disproportionately bearing that hurt, both when it comes to the financial hurt, but also public health impact because of the comorbidities of structural racism. Earlier today, the Financial Services Committee had a D&I, Diversity and Inclusion Subcommittee hearing under Chairwoman Beatty. And I do think this speaks to the power of diverse voices in Congress. This is the most diverse and representative Congress in the history of Congress. And it's the first time we've had a Diversity and Inclusion Subcommittee. And so what we learned there was just more sobering confirmation that if we don't address this meaningfully, if the Saving Our Street Act is not endorsed and integrated wholesale, or if tenets of it are not included, then the racial wealth gap will be exacerbated. We have those projections that 41% of Black-owned businesses will remain permanently shuttered. So it's devastating. It's a tsunami of hurt in every way.
Absolutely. And today, Dr. Fauci said that states that are seeing a surge in coronavirus cases should seriously consider shutting down again, like they did when the virus first hit in March. What impact do you think that's going to have on Black businesses?
Well, let me just start here. Our greatest wealth as a nation is our health. So the public health, and what epidemiologists, what science is saying, that needs to drive and inform these decisions. Of course, we want our families to be stabilized, but, what is the consumer confidence if people fear for their public health? So we have to address that first. And in the absence of leadership by this administration, which sees themselves as the backstop, and we started this pandemic behind, which is the worst position to be in a pandemic. Due to the science denials, the sluggish response, and the criminal negligence of this administration, both from a public health standpoint and an economic recovery standpoint, states and municipalities and Congress has had to stand in the gap in absence of that. We don't have a national testing strategy. So our governors and our mayors are having to stand in the gap of that. But it is incredibly worrisome.
So I'm glad that you're talking as well more broadly about some of those inequities when it comes to healthcare. As you're pointing out, coronavirus only exposed them, and it did not at all create them. As a member of Congress, what do you see as Congress's responsibility to address those inequities, and what do you think can be done legislatively to that point?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, there is unrest in our streets, and it's sustained unrest. There's unrest in our streets because there's unrest in the lives of Black Americans. And that's because of centuries of disproportionate hate, hurt, and harm that have been foisted onto Black Americans since the very inception of this country, from enslavement to unequal access to the GI Bill, to Jim Crow, to redlining. And so we're at a culture shift moment, but we need a power shift moment. And that's about how we legislate and also what's codified in our budgets. So the unrest is not only about police brutality, it's about every inequity and every racial injustice. And so some of the things that I'm proposing is that we have to cancel student debt. Black student borrowers borrow and default more than anyone else because of our inability to build generational wealth. So I see that as a racial justice issue. The average borrower has about $30,000 worth of debt. That will also jumpstart the economy by canceling that debt. We need to pass the bill that I introduced with Senator Booker, the Healthy Mommies Act, to address the maternal mortality crisis. The fact that in a developed nation, in a healthcare mecca like Massachusetts, that Black mothers are still 4 times more likely to die in childbirth or in post-birthing complications. And we need to modernize the Community Reinvestment Act. The fact that 98% of our financial institutions continue to pass these exams, when we know that the practice of redlining still persists, we need to be very targeted. We need to modernize the Community Reinvestment Act so that we can address the deficit and opportunity for homeownership, equity, and wealth building. Black homeownership today is the lowest it's been in 50 years.
Congresswoman, one of the questions I get very often is, when is that next round of $1,200 stimulus checks going to come? What is the status right now? You're in Congress. President Trump had said that he would support a more generous direct payments to Americans than Democrats would. Where are we on that?
Well, normally I carry around Mitch McConnell's phone number so that I can encourage people to lobby him directly and to say that I sent you. The reality is that this Democratic majority House has moved on a number of bipartisan relief bills to mitigate the hurt that everyday people are experiencing. And these bills are just sitting on the desk of Mitch McConnell because of the disconnect and the callousness of our colleagues across the aisle in that GOP-led Senate.
All right. Well, we will have to leave that conversation there. Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley from Massachusetts, thank you so much for joining us. Please come back sometime soon to have these conversations.
Absolutely. I'm just going to keep working and keep fighting. We'll get it done.